We're really grateful to have a Jesuit who hasn't yet been in Kansas City or at Rockhurst for a full year. He came to us last January. He came on somewhat of a special assignment, and his background aligned with some of our strategic vision. He teaches a couple of sections of personal finance, and I like to introduce him as the most overqualified high school personal finance teacher in the country, maybe the world. Father Carlos Esparza is a native of Dallas. He's a graduate of Jesuit High School in Dallas, our Jesuit high school there. He most recently, besides working at Rockhurst High School, goes over and does some information sessions for religious pursuing their Masters of Administration degrees in economics at this little place called the Gregorian University. Maybe you've heard of it. If you haven't heard of it, maybe afterwards ask a Jesuit what it is, but it's kind of a big deal. So when Father Carlos said, Dave, would it be okay if I miss a few days? I've got to go to the Gregorian. Generally, you say yes to that if you're me. Father Esparza got his degree in computer science from Harvard University. He then completed a master's in philosophy at Fordham University, a master's in statistics from Columbia University, his master's of divinity at the Jesuit School of Theology at Santa Clara University. He got a master's in economics at the University of Texas at Austin, and his PhD in economics at the University of Texas at Austin. So we're very grateful to welcome him tonight to our Jesuit Speaker Series with his topic, When Faith Moves Behavior, Using Economics to Study Religious Influence. Please welcome Father Carlos Esparza.
Well, good evening, everyone. Glad to be able to give the talk today. Kind of give you some background on this talk. This is part of a talk or part of a lecture I give to the same students at the Gregorian. So I kind of tailored it for this group, cut back several slides, but you'll see there's a lot of slides. We'll go through them to kind of give you some context about this topic. So we're going to explore what happens when faith moves behavior, how moral leadership can shape action even without coercion. So to kind of begin there, I think we should start at Vatican II. Okay, in Vatican II, we have the seminal document, Dignitatis Humanae, the Declaration on Religious Freedom. So this is now, we're getting to the 60th anniversary of this document. But the time was seen almost unheard of for the Catholic Church to say this. In the United States, we have this concept of religious freedom. Everyone has a right to their own religion. But among Catholics at the time in the world, it always seemed that there was one that was always going to be privileged, one that was always going to be that as Catholics we should try to, at the time, force people to be Catholic. But this document kind of shaped the whole idea. And the first one is that the truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth. And what it's saying there is that no one can be forced to belong or adhere to a certain religious faith. So no one needs to be forced in a manner contrary to one's beliefs. Okay? And so, again, it's trying to say that faith persuades, it doesn't compel. So it was freedom, religious freedom, in two senses. Religious freedom from coercion, so no one can be forced in the matters of faith, and freedom for truth. Our conscience is called to seek and embrace what is true. So, what does that mean for us? Well, it means that just because we have freedom, it doesn't mean that we're scot-free, we can do what we want. But religious freedom in this sense means that we have an obligation to discern, to seek what is true, and then to conform ourselves to that. Now, the Catholic Church says that the fullest form, the ultimate truth, is Jesus Christ, and we're going to find that ultimate truth within the Catholic Church. But then again, it's a way in which we ourselves can use and go evangelize and bring people to the faith. But it was a new concept in a sense to kind of say that we have religious freedom. And so God works through human freedom and conscience and works on our own holy desires to come and find for us to find our own truth and faith. So, again, the document affirms as a fundamental right religious freedom. And so, my topic here is looking at how economics and study influence that leaders have over the faithful. And so, under this idea is kind of where we're going to lead is, does this freedom actually empower religious leaders to shape behavior? We're saying we cannot compel, but can faith move hearts? So we're going to look at a couple studies to kind of talk about some ways in which religious leaders have moved people's behavior. First, we're going to talk about a couple studies related to papal visits. So the visits of John Paul II and Benedict XVI. So, two important studies, one was by Batsi and Rasul, looked at the travel of John Paul II to Brazil in 1991. And we're seeing how JP2's visit there affected the people that were in Brazil. The other one is done more recent study, looks at the papal visits to Italy. So we know that the Vatican City is inside Rome, but any visit outside Vatican City is considered a state visit in Italy. And so throughout the years, the popes would go visit different provinces of Italy. And so we're going to look at these two visits and see basically how the pope's message in each of these visits help shape people's behavior and encourage people to act and change. So specifically with the Brazil message, Pope John Paul II went in his message through 10 cities throughout his visit, was specifically focused on family life, focusing on pro-life message, focused on how Catholic families need to have more children. It was not any new doctrine that the church had, but it was just reintroduced, it was reaffirmed, and said many times through his visits. So it wasn't anything new. It was non-informative, but rather it was simply repeating things that the faithful had knew all the time. Even a non-informative event, so any event with no new teaching, can still affect people's behavior. So the emphasis on marriage and having children, along with the extensive media coverage that was in Brazil, made sure that the whole faithful in Brazil got this message. And so one of the results we find is that over his 10-city visit, the researchers found there was a 40% increase in women intending not to use contraception. Women decided with their families that they were going to have children. And what they found is that births spiked 9 months later, about 1.6% increase, which is equivalent to about 52,000 births happened 9 months later because of Pope John Paul II's visit. There was no change in long-time fertility, but rather the births were shifted up. So it didn't change the ideal family size that these families would have, but it moved their having children sooner than later. Now, the visits to Italy, this looks at visits from 1979 to 2012, 129 total papal visits. There are 85 provinces in Italy. In 1978, Italy legalized abortion. So this study specifically looks at John Paul II's and Benedict XVI's visits to Italy through the different provinces. And whenever they gave a talk or whenever they had a mass, that's what they called as an event. And they again found that immediately after, within a couple months after the visits, they found that abortion rates dropped 10 to 20%, with the effects lasting up to over a year. Now, the Pope was making these visits, didn't always talk about abortion. It was just this mere presence being there encouraged people not to have an abortion. But when he mentioned abortion in his talks, the effects were even stronger. And what the researchers kind of posit is the fact that by them being present, by them making this message, it made the doctrine more salient and more emotional, prevalent for them, and so that it caused them to reevaluate their own actions, caused them to reevaluate their own choices, and so it led to this behavioral change. So, the presence of the Pope, the repetition of a message, of a doctrine, and the fact that this message comes from the highest authority in the church, the Pope, it caused a changed behavior even when there was no new doctrine. So, that right there was very impressive to the researchers to see that the highest leader in the church can cause people to change their behavior. So, one of the things we can think about is that influence in religious behavior not just happens through policy, but happens through presence, it happens through a timing, and it happens through credibility. So the presence and message matters even with no new information, because the repetition of truth can make it new for people to see it in a new setting. By having these visits, it brought these topics to the forefront of people's minds. And a lot of these things, we can see that when the Pope visits, it's not just a talk like I'm giving, but usually it's a talk centered around prayer, centered around ritual. And so these settings, these communal settings, also made the message even more pertinent, a stronger reception for the people. So in both of these cases of Italy and Brazil, we find that faith moved behavior not only through coercion, but through presence. The kind of pastoral presence that speaks to hearts. And so, I think the question for us is, if Rome can move hearts globally, how can local shepherds move hearts in a local crisis? And so I'm going to shift to the context that we've all known the last 5 years, is looking at the crisis of faith that happened during a pandemic, during COVID. And to give some context, I'm going to talk about specifically one study, and then I'm going to go to some of my own research that looks at bishops' decisions and how that affected people going to church and their faith life. So, we know, we lived it. COVID represented a spiritual shock for many people. We know it disrupted our daily lives. We know schools shut down. We know grocery stores shut down. We know restaurants shut down. You just know what was going on. But it affected more than secular offices. We know it affected the church. We know churches closed, at least in the U.S., in mid-March. We know that sacraments were suspended. When masses were instituted, they were reopened. They only had a certain amount of people that go to Mass. We saw that isolation deepen throughout the whole area. So as an economist saw this as an opportunity to, this is a natural experiment. We can study this. So that's a very much an economist way of seeing things. But we know for believers, for us who are, thinking of our own selves, it was a deeply personal thing. Like, where is God in all this? How do we find God in this situation? COVID-19 wasn't only an economic and a public health crisis, it was a spiritual shock. And so we try to find where we found God in this moment. We found ways to pray together. Maybe it was through online masses. Maybe it was through streaming. I myself recall the powerful moment when Pope Francis had benediction in the Vatican. I think it was April of that year. For me, it was so powerful. I was with my family at the time, my parents. I was in my last year, or my second to last year of doctoral studies, and I was at my parents' house visiting them. My father, at the time, had dementia and has Parkinson's, and he was kind of out of it. But in that moment, we put that on the TV, watching Pope Francis and that benediction, it just made sense to him. The first time I saw it make sense. Prayer makes sense to him in a long time. I think that moment right there kind of shaped what we needed. We needed an outreach. We needed to have this faith. And I think there's a lot of studies that show that in times of crises, if you look in other studies in economics that relate to earthquakes, to natural disasters, other natural disasters of fires, that people turn to faith. And so one economist looked specifically to COVID and seeing how the people turn to faith. So Benson's paper, she looked at basically how did prayer change during COVID. And the way she measured how prayer changed is looking at Google searches, looking at Google trend data. So I don't know of you, whenever we type a term in Google, Google records it. And then we ourselves, we can actually look at this data and see, like, where are the popular searches for this week? We can look at the popular searches for a specific region. We can also see it over time. And so this is the data she kind of uses. And she looks at prayer, searching for prayer, and she finds that right when the pandemic happened in March 2020, or at least when the full scale of it and was starting to become aware to us, that the search for prayer was the largest it's ever been on Google. It surged 50% from the previous month's levels. It was bigger than 1.3 times than takeaway searches. Takeaway was restaurants, so takeout. Takeaway is the international way of it. 26% the size of the drop-in flight searches. So you imagine that in March, all flight searches pretty much dropped to nothing. So from a major business throughout the world, a large search you have on flights, and people use Google to search for flights all the time, that the amount of prayer search for prayer was about a quarter of the drop. So a big amount was on to prayer. So she looked specifically at the prayer searches from between January and April of 2020, so this first few months. And she compared it to other crisis-related search terms. So what are some other things that you think we might have searched during COVID? Netflix, right? Looking for streaming services. And so she even compares that. She finds that Netflix searches, searching for streaming, that rose, but search for prayer even rose higher and increased more sharply quickly. So it was one of these things where you see that this was a big thing. And so I pulled this from her study. I don't know from the back there, you can barely see it, but you can see the growth rate. And so on this map here, we have different colors of green. The darker green that there was a higher growth rate in terms of percent of the for prayer searches in Google. The lighter ones, there's an increase but lighter. And then the white, there's no data at all. But what she used specifically to measure this was looking at terms like prayer, also prayer for coronavirus, pray for the world, pray for Italy. If you remember at that time, Italy was starting to shut down and they were closing off different regions. Spiritual communion prayer. Especially when we think about Mass. When Mass went online, it was encouraged by bishops that for us to pray for spiritual communion. So these are the terms she looks at. And she finds that the increases are strongest in the more religious countries based on the number of people that they have data for that adhere to religion. And the reason she thinks this happens, and I think it's something that comes from psychology, it's again from the literature from other natural disasters, is the religious coping theory. So in crisis, people seek comfort, meaning, and control through spiritual practice. And so the unpredictability of COVID-19 fit this pattern of events that elicit this intrinsic religiosity. This elicits people coming back and just searching for God and trying to find God in the situation, praying for others. What was interesting, this rise was not just limited on Sundays when people were not going to church. It was throughout the whole week. And was not necessarily linked to closed churches either. So the search terms focus, as I gave some examples there, on personal prayers for healing, strength, and also prayers specifically for healthcare workers. So when the pandemic hit, we see that people turned to prayer. Benson tracked prayer terms across Google among 95 different countries. And as I said, it wasn't just a Sunday trend. People searched from every continent, across religions, and in many different languages. So even though churches were closed, people had a spiritual hunger. They were searching for an outlet. So, if our hearts turn to prayer, we now look, how did the church respond? And so specifically the research that I did with my co-authors, we're looking at how did the U.S. bishops' decisions about Mass obligations shape the faithful's participation as the restrictions were lifted. So we're going from global to a more local setting. So we know COVID-19 disrupted religious practice. And so U.S. bishops face a pastoral dilemma to protect health or to sustain sacramental life. When I was conducting this research, I emailed every diocese in the U.S., there's 175 different dioceses, and sent a letter to the bishop asking specifically if I could have data on when the bishop decided to close churches, when they decided to give dispensations, and when they decided to lift the dispensations. And I had a couple bishops write back saying that this was the hardest decision they ever made. Specifically, caring for their flock. The physical well-being and the spiritual well-being. There was that tension there. How do they make both meet? And so some, when I asked for this, wrote apologetically to me for what they did. Which, if I was in their situation, I think with the news that they had at the time, I think they made the best decisions that they could. But I think a lot of them regretted the decision a year and a half later, or 2 years later. So the bishop used what local data they had and what the medical science said at the time to decide when they would place churches, close churches, when they would issue dispensations, and when they would eventually, ultimately, lift the dispensation, requiring Catholics to go back to church. So this variation, across the U.S., each diocese is run by a bishop, and each bishop can make their own choice when they lift the dispensation up. This dispensation in terms of geographically, and also dispensation of timing of when they decide, allows economists, when I saw that, I was like, oh, this is a good study for a good natural experiment, for us to figure out what is the influence that bishops have on the faithful. We can actually measure this. And so that's what this study does. So, what I do specifically with my co-authors, we use data. And the data that we have comes from this company called SafeGraph Incorporated. And basically what SafeGraph does, they're pretty much a data broker for some cell phone companies. And they tabulate cell phone data, and they amass it up, and they aggregate it. And they then give this data to researchers or to businesses that can purchase it. They want to see what kind of foot traffic there might be in their business over certain times. And so, as a researcher, I was able to get this data, having over 15 million smartphones, signals, and we kind of use this as a proxy for church visits. So, what we do is, if someone goes to church and they have the cell phone on them, it pings a tower, we know where they're located, and so we assume that they're at church. And so this data can get very close to, within a certain amount of, 10 feet of where someone's located. And so they're in a parking lot of a church. We assume that they're at the church. So in this data specifically, looking in the United States, we had over 440,000 religious organizations. So as classified by a code in ICS, every business has a specific code based on what industry they're in. So if you're in retail, you would have a specific number code. If you're a restaurant, you have a number code. If you're a bowling alley, if you're a freight company, churches have a specific code, religious organizations. So not all of these 440,000 religious organizations were churches, and not all of them, obviously, were Catholic. And so that led us to have to go through this data. And the first part of it, I went one by one trying to identify Catholic churches. I did first pass through, and we did pretty well on that. But then we wanted to expand this from the Catholic Church to look at other religions, to Protestant, to Hindu, to Muslim. And so at that point, that's when we relied on AI to do that. And so we actually use it as a research tool. So I now tell my students, AI, you have to be careful with it, but AI is also very helpful in terms of coding and trying to identify terms. And so we used AI to identify these churches, and I'll show you a slide where it shows that we're pretty accurate on it. And then we focus specifically on service days. So with Catholics, we focus on Saturday evenings and Sundays for masses, for obligations. We see Sunday for Protestants, Saturdays for Jews, Fridays for Muslims, etc. So that's kind of one thing we do with it. And then we normalize the data, kind of to make any sense of it. We look at the pre-pandemic attendance that we have, and we normalize it to that. So when I show you some slides in a second, I'll explain that a little bit better so you can understand what I'm exactly showing to you. So the first thing I'm just showing you is that the work that we did was actually pretty good in terms of identifying religious organizations. So right here we have a graph, and basically we have a 45-degree line, and if we did a good job we would have these points along the 45-degree line, which we see pretty well for Catholics, Protestants, for most of them. There are some Jehovah's Witnesses, a smaller group, that's a little bit more hard to detect. But on the axis, on the y-axis, we have the number of congregations. So every 10 years, there is a census that's conducted by an organization that churches send in their data, and this census calculates what percent religions are in different counties. It also has a number of churches in that county. So we use that data specifically to count how many are in the United States these organizations are. And then on the x-axis is using our identification, how many churches we identified in the data. And we see that it's almost 1-for-1 for several of these religious organizations. So we were very close to what we expected. So it's a pretty sound method. In some ways, using geolocation data, you can find God in all things. So trying to find people's religious behaviors. So on the next slide, I'm presenting something that's very local. I just created this slide 2 days ago. I wasn't able to perfect it or finish it up, but this actually looks at foot traffic data for the Kansas City metro area for 2 different dioceses. I just made this graph the other day. The dark blue line is the foot traffic data for Kansas City Archdiocese, and the gold line is for Kansas City St. Joseph. So I'm going to kind of show some things over here. I'm going to try to speak loudly so you can hear me. So on the y-axis, this is the ratio of 2019 average. So what the at 1 means, like if it's at 1, that means, oh, the foot traffic for Mass is the same as it was in 2019. So that's why I have this line right here. So whenever this blue line, so before 2020, you see that the blue line is going up around the 1, an average of that, and that's the average for that particular diocese. Same for the gold. Then we see that in January we have a spike because around Christmas, right before Christmas and New Year's, and then you see all of a sudden foot traffic drops in March. And so that's coinciding with the closures of the churches. And then we see that at some point the churches reopened, and we see that Casey Kagan's the darker blue, the navy. We see that there was a bigger rebound in the Kansas side. And that we see on the Missouri side, things lagged a while before starting back to close to 1, and that was in 2022. If you remember in January 22, we see another drop because that was when there was a variant that came out. I think it was, I can't remember what it was now. Maybe it was Omega Alpha. I can't remember. Yeah, I can't remember. It's funny how soon you forget these things. But things dropped again, but then you see by the time it rebounds again. So I haven't studied deeper on this. I was asking Mr. Laughlin specifically when I had in the data that churches reopened and on the Kansas side in May of 2020, I think. And I think in Missouri they opened in August of 2020. End of August. Yeah, that's what I have. So I wonder in some ways that my guess is looking at this data right here is that maybe some people from the Missouri side decided going to church on the Kansas side because the churches were opened. Does that sync well with anything that you guys remember? Okay. So that's just me looking at the data. Okay. So I think that's what happened. And so that's why you see that the slow recovery and Kansas City St. Joseph Diocese. So I could look at the area total. I haven't done that. I could have summed up the total and area and kind of see if it looked like it went back to regular. If you add them up, maybe the averages come out to about right. But it seems like maybe it displaced people jumping across state line around here. It's probably easy to go to Kansas, to go to Mass there. So this is just for this area. Then I'm going to show you the foot traffic. Next slide is looking at Catholics going back to church versus when Protestants went back to church. Yes, do you have a question?
Did you consider combining the two dioceses as though they were one?
I think I'm going to do that. I didn't have time to do it for this, but yeah, that's exactly. I think that might explain it. So the area might get back closer to return to normal faster than it looks like here. So
the high school sits on State Line Road, and I live near State Line Road. A lot of people do. You just go back.
Exactly. You just go. Yeah. You decide where you want to go one week or the other, right? And so I would imagine if this is what when we were doing this research, we specifically put this case in terms of trying to control for that, saying that if you're around a border of a diocese, they have different timings, then people could easily just, at least on the border, could jump across pretty easily. So this So I'll explain this. This is a little bit more complicated. I'm sorry for all you guys back there. It might be hard for you to see. This now looks at, across the United States, the foot traffic for Catholics and foot traffic for Protestants. Okay, comparing the two. The dark blue is Protestants, the light blue is Catholics. And so let me just explain this to you. Okay. I also have on it two other lines. One is a line that shows you when dispensations were lifted in the Catholic Church, and a line when restaurants were reopened. Because a lot of feedback we got is like, well, could this just be people coming back to church because restaurants are opened, they're secular reopenings, or people are just going back to church regardless. So we try to put those in. They're trying to give you an idea of the timing of it. And we see specifically that, well, that churches, they respond to it in some ways, but they're slow to respond. So again, we have this line of 1. So there's normalization. Again, you see that both Catholics and Protestants are in 2019 before pandemic are around 1. The average is at 1. And then we see immediately again a drop. We see that the drop is steeper for Catholics than for Protestants right away. And then we see there's a recovery. And then we see that throughout until the end of 2022, you see that Protestants' attendance supersedes that Catholics. The Protestants have had a quicker bounce back to going back to church. And so these are the lines right here. I told you these dashed lines. This dashed line right here is when restaurants reopen. It is right. The right side is telling the share of restaurants that are reopened. Okay? And so at this point we see here, this point right here would be like 20% of restaurants are reopened right now. And so we see this bump here. This is when you have 100% are reopened. The same thing with the dark lines dispensations. The number of dispensations have been lifted. We see that mostly all dioceses have dispensations at this point. And so we see people come back to church when all dioceses have dispensations haven't been lifted. But then they start lifting. We see that there's people are coming back to the church. The Catholics are, okay? So we see that this is visual evidence. Is just kind of show, it's not looking at a causal thing right here, but we see the timing looks like when dispensations are lifted, people are coming back to church. But overall, we see that Catholics are slower to respond because the obligation was suspended for pretty long. Okay? So the next one I'm going to show you is a lot of people, this is a complaint that I heard from some bishops, from some priests. A complaint I made in my head several times too is like, well, malls are open, and restaurants are open, and movie theaters are open. Why can't churches be open? So we're now going to look at the different trends between, again, the foot traffic for Catholics going to church and for people going to restaurants. I hope you don't get depressed. Okay. So we have the same thing here. The light blue is the line you already saw of Catholics. And you see restaurants again here. We see a drop in restaurants, and we see they have a higher, quicker, faster return to normalcy than the churches, whether it's Catholic or Protestant too. So I also have graphs for the other religious. I think on the last slide I have things I can show you for mainline Protestants, for evangelicals, for Orthodox, for Jewish, for Muslim. Catholics are the slowest to respond of all those groups. And so again, as I look at this, my hypothesis is because of the implementation of the dispensation, the removal of the obligation to go to church. So, there's just a little information on dispensations, which I think you all know because you experienced it. I usually have to present this to people who are not Catholic when I give these at conferences, and they're like, what are you talking about? There's rules like this. The ins and outs of the Catholic Church. So my co-authors love having me around because I can go a little bit more in depth than they could. So as I said, in the U.S., there's 175 different dioceses, and each diocese made a decision based on the bishop's orders about when to offer a dispensation and when to remove it. The first closure and dispensation in the U.S. happened on March 11th, 2020. The first churches started to reopen in May or June of 2020. We saw that May 5th was the Archdiocese of Kansas City. At least that was information I got from the Archdiocese. But we know that dispensations remained in effect for several months, maybe for more than a year, a couple years, and they lifted at varying times across the country. The median diocese, so if you look at it, so if you put all the dioceses out there, all 175, the middle diocese lifted their dispensation, put the obligation back going to church 54 weeks after closure, or after it was granted, so more than a year later. So for more than half the diocese, people were not obligated to go to church for over a year. So it was a long thing. So I'm going to show you a map. So this map shows you the timing of dispensations being lifted, okay, across the United States. So this shows all 175 dioceses with the exception of the 3 in Alaska, so 172 in the continental U.S. The darker reds are the dioceses that lifted the dispensations earlier. The lighter color is when they lifted later. So I'm just going to point out to Kansas City, Missouri real quick. Kansas City St. Joseph is a darker red than Archdiocese of Kansas City. But we saw the return to Mass there was stronger, so it seems like people here were more not concerned with the dispensation as much and the obligation. They went regardless when they were even exempted from going to church, more than other places. But the timing, I looked at the dates, the timing are only 5 days away, so probably didn't affect in terms of like going from Sunday to Sunday. I think Kansas City St. Joseph, they lifted dispensation June 1st, 2021. The Archdiocese of Kansas City was June 5th, 2021, so 4 days. So it just happened, that's where it cut off in terms of the data. But you see some of the areas where you had dispensations being lifted early. You see some in Texas, some in Georgia. We have New York, we have Boston, we have some in Michigan. You have it kind of spread out through the country. So it wasn't just particularly Republican areas. Conservative areas were opening up quicker than other ones. The churches, that didn't play out politically, looking at this map. One of the latest ones were in California, New Mexico, even in Texas. So you see that, I think when I started to study I think I started looking at this in the fall of 22, or maybe it was 2023. I think there were 2 dioceses that still hadn't lifted the dispensation yet. And I think they were both in California. So we're talking 2 or 3 years later. They were still there. I think some had lifted it, then they put it back in place when they had the spike of coronavirus. So I'm going to show you a graph on the next slide, and it's going to look like a bunch of coefficients. Just bear with me, and I will just I just want to show you visually what it looks like so you can have an idea. I'm not going to quiz you on this. So this is the main result of the paper. And what this does, I could show you the equations and show you all the data and how we did it, but I think that would bore everyone to death, including myself at times. But specifically what this shows, this estimate right here, is so you've heard of correlations and you've heard of causality, right? Something's correlated, something's causal. So the technique we used, and based on some assumptions we have, this is a causal estimate, so it's not a correlation. So we're saying that bishops deciding to impose the obligation of Mass actually caused people to go back to church. We're not saying it's correlated, it's caused. And the way we did this, we controlled for several things. We controlled for when, as I showed already, when restaurants reopened, to kind of get a sense of the local area. We controlled for political affiliation in the areas. We controlled for virus rates, hospitalization rates. We had all these controls in there in our design. So what this shows you here, both lines are basically telling you the same thing. This is our estimate, and we see a red line. So all the way back, you might see a vertical red line. That vertical red line says that's right before dispensations were rescinded, okay? And each point afterwards is the coefficient, the estimate for 1 week after the dispensation was removed, 2 weeks after the dispensation was removed, and so forth. And so what we find is that immediately after the dispensation was removed, we see a bump the first week. We see it's about 5%, 4 to 5% bump. which means that there's a 4 or 5% bump in attendance that's directly caused by the bishops making a decision to impose obligation. And we see that it lasts for about 6 weeks. Okay? These are standard errors. We want the bars to be above this blue line because that means it's actually significant. It's not zero. And that we see that it's positive. It's always positive, but we see that it's significant all the way through about week 6. Okay? So it lasts for about a week and a half. People are coming back. It causes people to come back to church for about a week and a half, and then it levels out. Okay? So it gets that initial jump, and then things kind of even out. It doesn't continue to increase because at some point, you're going to have everyone at church, and so attendance can't increase farther than what it is or where you were beforehand. So although the effect is temporary, it's very significant. It shows us that faith responds to moral invitation. This is not being coerced. The bishops are just basically saying we're moving dispensations, and people respond to it. So, just one more graph like this, I promise, and then we'll get close to some conclusions to this talk. This is looking at the estimate based on diocese, based on the level of Catholics, the percent of Catholics in the area. So we have dioceses, the higher Catholic percentage versus dioceses that don't. The light blue is dioceses that have a high Catholic percentage. So the top 50% of those dioceses, the bottom 50%. And we see here, again, that the estimates are higher for the light blue. So people, Catholics and dioceses where there's more Catholics, are more likely to respond when the bishops remove the dispensations. So how can we interpret that? Well, I think it shows that you have this communal aspect. If your neighbor is going back to church, or a bishop, you might hear that churches are reopened or the dispensations removed from your neighbor, or perhaps the bishop's message comes out more clearly in that, or you maybe just have more of a communal draw, just go back to church in those areas because it's more Catholic, there's more community. So we see that in the higher Catholic areas, we see people respond longer and also with a more fervency to go back to church. So we see that when we're connected with others, more likely to respond to the initiatives or the invitations that are issued by the leadership in the Catholic Church. So, we find overall the first results were kind of showing the foot traffic. We saw that by the end of 2022, both Catholics and Protestants kind of returned to about 90% of their pre-pandemic levels of church attendance. And we saw that lifting the Mass obligation had a clear effect, and that leadership mattered, that the bishops' decisions moved real behavior. Now, when I showed this or I talked about this, a lot of economists are kind of very skeptical about religion playing a role in people's lives, and so that you can actually get a clean empirical design with a causal estimate on actually faith moving people's behaviors, they're shocked. So, even though it seems like, 5%, big deal, but for them that's something, and they're like, okay, and they're actually realizes that they need to start opening up and realizing that religion plays a role in people's lives, especially in people's choices, than just simply government policy. So what does this mean? Well, we know that the bishop's choices moved people to go to church, but the deeper story is not statistical. The stats help us see the deeper story. It's a spiritual story. The pattern shows that when people are invited and not compelled, they respond. But it's a powerful sign about how freedom and faith work together. So kind of going back to our opening scene of Dignitatis Humanae, that freedom of religion, we see that people respond, and through persuasion, through connection with others, that people will respond to the faith. So these are some takeaways from this talk. Starting back, freedom is the foundation. So it reminds us that true religious freedom honors the dignity of every person to allow them to make their choices. It goes back to, I think, a famous saying maybe that Archbishop Sheen said at one point, we don't teach them, talking about Catholic education, we don't teach them because they're Catholic, We teach them because we're Catholic. So we need to go out, meet people, and we need to be men and women for others because that's who we are, not expecting them to necessarily to be the people that we want to serve, that they're already Catholic and already within our own religious sensibilities. So that's one thing we do evangelization for. We see that pastoral voices move lives. We saw that with the papal studies. When the Pope speaks clearly and with passion, that the faithful chose life. They embraced family and had renewed hope. We find that repetition. Sometimes, my students, I might repeat the same thing over and over, but it's also a Jesuit tactic, repetitio, always do repetition of lessons, but it does help. People hear it, and if it's done in new ways, it may make them be more salient for people, and people will react to those messages. We talked about how crisis awakens the soul from the study from Benson, talking about how people turn to prayer in times of crisis and times of uncertainty. They sought God's mercy and presence, sought healing for others. We saw that local leadership matters and shapes the church. So the bishop's decisions about closing churches and dispensations moved people about how they would attend church, and how they would worship. And it says that leaders should lead boldly, that they can be strategic about how they evangelize because they're not necessarily just speaking from a soapbox. People are actually listening. People can hear them. They can use moments of crisis. They can use moments when people are tied together in community to help reinforce teachings and actually to move people to some spiritual truths. And so on the last one, I just have a quote from Pope Francis. Be shepherds with the smell of the sheep. And I think that's something we tell our leaders, but I think it's something that all of us can do that. We all can reach out. We know that it's not always, we can use persuasion, we can use accompaniment to bring people to the faith, to church. And economics shows that there's actually ways that religion can actually move and impact people.